From the Historyogi Podcast, this is Dave. The Singapore Heritage Fest this year celebrates our nation's rich built heritage. One of the most striking examples of this are the public housing estates which dominate Singapore's urban landscape. How did we remake the island's colonial era urban spaces into Singapore's earliest HDB estates? How did rehousing Singaporeans change our lifestyles and hopes for the future? What does the kampong spirit mean when we think about the past? To answer these questions, we speak to Dr. Loh Kah Seng, author of the book Squatters into Citizens. In this special episode, let's learn about the history of public housing and urban redevelopment in Singapore. Please note that the map referenced in this episode can be found via the link in the podcast description. So, thanks very much, Dr. Loh, for joining us today. To start off, after the Second World War, the urban kampongs flourished at the margins of the city area. Could you share what these urban kampongs were, why they grew so quickly, and what were some consequences from this?
Yep. So here is a map that I think perfectly shows the development of the kampongs, the location of these new kampongs, right? So previously, most of these were very small villages with maybe a few houses, and most of these houses were quite well built. And then the kampongs grew and grew. So the map here shows in the 1950s and 1960s, the locations of the kampongs. There were more than 50 of them, right? If you include the ones here up to 57 in Race Course Road. So they grew out of the main roads leading out of the central area. The central area is the two banks of the Singapore River, which we usually call Chinatown, and actually includes a bit of the area to the south, which was the Port of Singapore, Tanjong Pagar. So if you just follow the roads out of Chinatown, right? You follow Victoria Street, Kallang Road, Geylang Road, and you'll find in the Geylang Lorongs here. Yeah. And just before you enter the Geylang Lorongs, the first of the kampongs to the east, including Kampong Bugis and Kampong Supu. And then if you find this road here, right? Serangoon Road. And of course, this is Little India, right? So these are the shop houses here. And then Upper Serangoon Road, you find more kampong leading up to Paya Lebar. If you go north, past Orchard Road, which is, if I am not wrong, Orchard Road mainly private, and you reach Bukit Timah here, you've got some kampongs. And then further north of that will be Toa Payoh, which is a huge area of farms. And then further westwards, you'll find the most westernmost kampong marked here is in Pasir Panjang. So this is the whole city area. It was a huge city of 1 million plus people at the time. And a lot of them were living in the kampongs. But the kampong population was still smaller than the population in the central area. Most people still live in the central area where the housing was even more congested, mostly shop houses, which had almost become the slums. You could no longer add stories to the shop houses, and you could no longer partition the shop houses into smaller cubicles and partitions. So people were moving out. That's one reason. That's the main reason for the creation of the urban kampongs. So if this had been allowed to continue, right, then there'll be even more urban kampongs, and those kampongs will actually probably become slums if there was no assistance given to them, right, in terms of social amenities, water, electricity, sewage disposal, because the land, the area where an urban kampong could be built is kind of limited actually. They must be built somewhere along the main roads because people want to travel back to the central area where their jobs were, where their relatives were. And so they cannot live inside in the interior of the land. They must live near the main roads. So the urban kampongs were like a temporary, makeshift, self-built solution to the housing problem of Singapore after the Second World War, but they were not a long-term one. I think they are sustainable if they receive government assistance or they receive assistance from the community organizations. But in most cases, they did not.
So you've given us a kind of an overview of where the kampongs were located, how they spread across the outer fringes of the city. What would you say are some consequences of this growth?
I think overall they were very positive for Singapore, right? They contributed to the growth of the population, which was seen as a big problem at the time. But these are our baby boomers today and the pioneers, the pioneer and the Merdeka generations who've made Singapore today. They allowed these families to be housed because there's no way those families could have stayed in the shop houses where the cubicles were much smaller. The cubicles were mainly were all right in a way, right? For the coolies, which were usually single men, or for very small families, right? Like husband and wife, maybe a child. But even then, the shop houses of Chinatown were already coming apart at the seams, right? Before the Second World War came. And then the kampongs allowed the land to be developed for housing, almost like the same way that our land is used for HDB housing today. So in a sense, they were kind of the precedents, and the kampongs were really dynamic settlements. That's why people today have a lot of nostalgia for the kampongs, not only because of the sense of neighborliness and all that, but they were filled with young people, right? Because usually the young families were moving out of Chinatown and Tanjong Pagar. And young families are kind of dynamic at the time and a lot of children. And these kampongs sort of tried to take care of themselves, right? The British colonial government didn't have a very positive view of the kampongs. They saw that they were illegal. The housing was illegal. The land office had no control over them. The SIT had unable to find land for its own housing because this land was all occupied by what they call squatters. So they tried to take care of their own problems. And so communities emerged very spontaneously and organically. And one of the ways, right, which came to the breaking point at the end of the 1950s and just before the Bukit Ho Swee fire was how to deal with the threat of fire, right? And they began to form their own firefighting squads. Often these squads were encouraged by the city council, right? So the city council gave them some support. Like they gave them some basic fire, like poles and to pull down the atap roofs from the houses if they were burning and things like that. But usually most of the manpower, all the manpower and the effort came from the community who provided the manpower, the young men to patrol these settlements. And if they spotted a fire, they would put it out before it grew out of control, right? These were very flammable areas because the housing was built very close to each other. You would not find a kampong like this in Choa Chu Kang or Yishun, you know. Those are much safer kampongs because they were properly organized. And given the choice, people wouldn't want to live so close to each other without adequate fire breaks between very flammable buildings. So overall, it's good. In Singapore history, we've often looked at these urban kampongs with a lot of distaste, right? Because they are eyesore, right? And social impediment to the plans for development and housing. But I would see that they were modern in their own ways, right? They had their own culture of modernity. They were a sign that Singapore was going to do well after the war. They, of course, needed some help from the government. People needed some help from the government to build proper houses for them and to control the population growth, right?
So, aside from housing a growing population after World War II, what was life like in the typical urban kampong, such as Bukit Ho Swee?
Most of the people living in the kampongs were quite young. The aging population that we have today, which is becoming a big problem, didn't really happen then, right? There were some old people who had settled down in Singapore and were living with the younger families, but they didn't form the main population, right? I would say probably the older people are in the Chinatown area. So the families were trying to work. They were trying to find employment. So very often you find people, I mean, that's why the kampongs were linked by the roads to Chinatown and Tanjong Pagar, because that's where the sources of employment were, right? If one wanted to leave a village and not adopt a village life, right? Because you don't get paid working in a village very much. And so they try to find work in Chinatown where the businesses were, where the civil service was, the colonial civil service were, and later the Singapore civil service after self-government. The problem was that the economy was based on the entrepot trade. So there were not many jobs at the time. There were jobs, there was work, there was a need for wage work and wage workers, but you don't have the jobs that we have today, which is a full-time 9 to 5, 5-day job. So people were underemployed and they would work part of the time in the city, and then a large part of their time was spent idling away. And then there would be a lot of underemployed youths, and those young men would often sit around together with the older men, the kind of middle-aged adults, in the coffee shops, right? And that's what gave the kampongs a bad name, because if a stranger walks in, right, it's not like today I go to another housing estate and I can have a plate of chicken rice at a coffee shop. You can't do that in the past. If you try to do that, you'll be marked out from the moment you appeared at the doors of the kampong, and they'll ask you, what are you doing there, right? So this is often associated with tourism and the secret societies in the kampong. So every kampong would have several of these gangs. On the other hand, there was no police in the kampong, so the gangs would take up this policing job. They usually take fairly good care of the residents, except for extortion and except for their gang fights, which sometimes would hurt people. Extortion could be quite bad if some of the shopkeepers or vendors refuse to pay up. So life in the kampong, I would say, compared to HDB life, very different. A lot of people have talked about it, right? That the doors are open and you can walk through your neighbor's doors and come out on the other side. Like I said in the beginning, they were very closely packed together, the houses. So I had a map, a photograph, and taken from a plane, an aerial photograph. So if you look down, you can see hardly how the hell do you make your way to your house or to the coffee shop. But people knew the way. And funny enough, when people moved to HDB estates, they often got lost at first because all the blocks look the same. It is not too unfamiliar to us, actually. So if we go to a HDB estate that we're not familiar with, often we do not know the way because it's quite disorientating, right? Without the use of a handphone. But people were quite familiar with the ways of the kampong, and that shows that it was a viable way for them to live. It wasn't, physically from above, it looked kind of chaotic, but as with squatter settlements elsewhere, if you go to Bangkok, if you go to Manila, you find that people find a way, right? And after the Second World War, people were beginning to find a way, reaching out towards the future of Singapore.
Now, in 1959, so the PAP was newly elected into power. How was their approach to urban development compared with the colonial authorities?
There's a lot of continuity, actually. So if you look at the early HDB reports, they were very adamant about distinguish themselves from the SIT, which they portray as a complete failure. So the HDB always counted the number of flats they built. So I think there was one time in the early 60s where they were saying they were building 45 flats a minute or something like that. So the quantity was different. But in terms of the overall plan and the kind of urban landscape, the planning of how places were going to be redeveloped, a lot of it came from what the British were doing, what the Labour Front government, mostly under Lim Yew Hock, was doing, and what the SIT in particular was doing. So the SIT had one big contribution at the end of its institutional life, which was to finally agree to build emergency flats. I just imagine all these well-trained upper-class British architects and planners with a lot of experience on their CV and education in Britain. What are emergency flats, really? So there was one study, right, that showed that when it comes to comparing emergency flats by the HDB And the kampongs or the shop houses to the ordinary working class Singaporean at the time, there was no difference except maybe cleanliness and hygiene. People didn't see a difference. That's how basic and rudimentary the emergency housing was. They were 1 to 3 rooms. A lot of them were 1 or 2 rooms. Some of the 1 room and 2 rooms had shared facilities like shared toilets, shared kitchens. They were called emergency flats because they could be built very quickly at little cost. And so they couldn't last very long, right? I mean, they were not in danger of falling off because Singapore doesn't have earthquakes, but the material was pretty bad. And to the credit of HDB, they converted a lot of them to proper HDB house standard housing within 5 years or so. And by the early 80s, all of them had been demolished. So that was the difference. The SIT decided that, okay, we can no longer afford to build standard, very nice and spacious SIT flats, right? Like the ones you see in Tiong Bahru, right? Which now the yuppies are living in. Very comfortable, bigger than most HDB flats today. So when the HDB came in, HDB didn't have that kind of reservation, right? Because they sacked most of the European architects. So they had mostly local architects, which they could influence, which the government could basically tell. HDB, you are a housing agency. SIT was not a housing agency. It was an improvement agency. You could tell HDB, I want you to build emergency housing, and the architects of HDB would say, yes, we will do so, or else they have to find alternative employment. So behind the HDB plan and what marked the difference between the HDB and SIT was the government's political commitment to public housing, to housing all the population of Singapore that needed housing. But the board owed a big debt in terms of the legacy that inherited from the SIT architects and planners in terms of the emergency flats. It was really the emergency flats that broke the back of the housing problem in Singapore.
Now, the Bukit Ho Swee fire, which occurred on 25th of May 1961, is one of Singapore's most iconic historical events, which dramatically raised the profile of public housing and urban redevelopment as a government priority. What were some challenges that the government faced in responding to the disaster and its aftermath?
The scale, definitely, right? The previous biggest fire was the immediate one before it, the one at Tiong Bahru, just opposite the road from Bukit Ho Swee in 1959, in February, just before the general elections that year. So in Bukit Ho Swee, the number of fire victims was at least registered formally, right? At 16,000, just under 16,000 compared to the 5,000 odd in the Tiong Bahru fire. So big test of organization, bureaucracy. So in that sense, the HDB was able to respond. The government also, the government itself responded as a whole. It was one of the early cases, right, in that period of whole of government effort. So social welfare came in to provide rations and relief, register the families to give them relief. Ministry of Education provided the relief centers, which were mostly the schools, and also People's Association with the community centers, which also serve as the relief centers. HDB, of course, played the main role, right? Because while the fire victims were moved out to the relief centers for a couple of weeks, and then they were moved out to the temporary housing. Most of the temporary housing was just in Tiong Bahru nearby, had already been built by the SIT. So again, right, the SIT's contribution to the Bukit Ho Swee fire. Some of them moved out to the Kallang area. The HDB's main task was to take care of the fire site and rebuild it into an emergency housing estate. So the first blocks came up just under a year in record time. Yeah. So that prevented the fire victims from moving back and rebuilding the kampongs, which is what fire victims would usually do if the area was not fenced off and they were prevented from moving there. So subsequently, most of the fire victims moved back to Bukit Ho Swee. Some of them remained where they were in the eastern side. And a few, I think a fair number moved back to kampongs elsewhere, right? So there was still some people who were quite determined to continue with kampong life and try to live in the kampongs, which were getting reduced in number as the HDB was able to build more emergency housing. So see the multi-story, right? Like 9-story, 16-story, right? Those were the highest HDB flats at the time. You can build a lot more apartments and house a much bigger population that you can have on a flat land and on a flat terrace housing. So that means you can move people from the nearby kampongs because people may have not so much resistance if the new HDB flats were not so far away. It's still okay, right? It's not like you have to move to Queenstown. Queenstown was considered very far away, right? Again, SIT built Queenstown, the first 2 neighborhoods. But if you look at the maps, Queenstown and Tiong Bahru, Queenstown and Red Hill, there's a big distance, a big difference in terms of the distance from Chinatown. So it was a masterful project of rehousing people, and that laid the kind of a template for successive HDB estates to be built, right? Replacing the kampongs one by one.
Now, you did mention earlier about some of the considerations in rehousing the fire victims. High-rise housing at that point of time was still a novelty, even though we consider it to be very normal these days. How did former kampong dwellers cope with the change of living in high-rise housing?
Yeah, I think the key to understanding housing in Singapore is always fractured. It's never what do Singaporeans feel about housing, right? It always depends on who you are in terms of your profile, in terms of your background. What is your social class? What's your age? Age is very important. Maybe to some extent, what's your ethnicity? So age, right? Coming back to age, the older people were the ones who faced the greatest difficulty in adapting to HDB housing. Partly because of the height of the housing, older people were very afraid of the new technology called lifts. And they almost got trapped in their own houses. Sometimes they were isolated from people of their age. So you see today in the coffee shops, old people would gather around and chit-chat. That was very difficult to do in the early HDB estates because you got to come down from your flat and you got to know who your former neighbors in the kampong, where had they gone. They might not be in the same area or even, they might not be in the same block or even in the same area. So there is an unwritten history of the moving to HDB flats, the HDB experience, so to speak, for the elderly people. For the younger people, it was mostly a big joy. So ironically, the people who complain about kampong spirit and the loss of the kampong spirit, the community, the gotong royong, complain about neighbors not greeting them or not having good neighbors. They were the ones probably who were very excited about moving into HDB flats because remember now people who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they were the baby boomers in the 50s and the 60s. The experience of turning on the tap and seeing the clean water come out, the electricity, the light that they could have, they used to live quite a much darker life, like literally in the kampongs, right? Once the sun goes down, it was very dim. It's a very dim world in the kampongs. In the HDB housing was very friendly and very appealing to many of the younger people. My father felt that moving to a HDB flat was a great joy, right? And he was a lower class person. So it didn't matter so much. If you are lower class, right? If you're working class or you're not educated, you just simply move into a smaller flat with lower rentals. So if you did better, then you move into a bigger one, right? But there wasn't so much class segregation at the time because the estates would be filled with a mix of 1 to 3 room HDB flats, and then the bigger 4 or 5 room flats came in later. So the experience varied, and that's an important point to note. And the other thing to say would be people began to adapt to HDB living, mostly successfully. I mean, there were many complaints in the early days of the HDB about noise and things like that, rubbish, urinating in the lifts. That was a commonly cited problem. But within the confines of the walls of their flat, most people were very happy. They became happier when the economy grew, as the multinationals came in, the GLCs grew, and people had wages, right? And then they began to buy the television, the fridge, and all these appliances at home. And the home therefore changed. It wasn't just a house anymore. It wasn't just shelter, but it was now kind of a plaything almost for the modern families of Singapore with increasing disposable income, right? You could renovate, you could decorate, you get interior designers to come in and you populate the house with things that you consume. They allow you to consume things, better food, perishable food. You can now have access to television, radio, music, and of course, a wide range of furniture. And those industries which supply these things, right, had a really profitable business during this period.
Now, of course, when we talk about urban redevelopment, it's not just only about the physical aspects of it, but also about how society evolved along with the change. So, looking at the vast changes in Singapore's urban landscape from the 1960s, this also influenced the government's relationship with the people. I mean, a casual way of life became increasingly incorporated within a more formalized system with official oversight. Could you share more about how and why this situation evolved?
All right. What happened with the urban landscape was quite similar to what was happening in Singapore in other sectors, which was the creation of a very new Singapore in many ways. So with the HDB housing, people began to rely on the HDB for housing, which was never happened before. Previously, before the HDB, before PAP, the only housing that was provided for people, right, were the staff quarters that the British colonial government and its agencies or major European companies would provide, right, for their employees. So all that was gone, together with the kampongs and the shop houses. We all know, right, 80% of the population of Singapore began to live in public housing. So the reliance is one thing. And the reliance on housing became tied with the reliance on the ability to pay for the housing, which was you can easily purchase a HDB flat after HDB relaxed its rules in 1968 for home ownership. But you can only pay your 10 to 30-year loan if you have a proper job, if you have a full-time job. So your employment changed from underemployment to full-time employment or even overtime employment, right? Like most people would be having too much work instead of too little work. So that meant that you needed to hold on to your job, and working full-time became instrumental to owning the house. Yeah, so you became more tied to the economy, to your job, and that became the center of your energies. And that also meant that then the family size dwindled, even in the 1980s when the government tried to raise it again. And the people became, of course, less of a community. You could say that we became a national community, we became a nation, right? The members are part of this imagined community, although they don't know most of the people in the community. They would regard each other as members of a whole. But the kind of local community vanished. The HDB estates didn't really have communities. I mean, you still have some neighbors, some corridors of neighbors, the next door neighbor, in some cases, right, especially among the housewives. So again, there is a distinction to be made, right, according to gender as well. So those housewives A lot of the women went out to work, of course, but they would usually quit after they got married or they had their first child. And then they will be at home. They will be homemakers. And then this gives them the opportunity to develop relationships with their neighbors. So there's a kind of community, right? Although it's not a real community because it didn't spread to the whole of the block. So what was lost in that sense is the community, right? And together with the development of Singapore, the increase in wages, having middle class lifestyle, Singapore kind of became more selfish in a way, right? The way we understand more selfish, materialistic, much more materialistic, much more family focused, right? Not so much focus in the affairs of their neighborhood or their community. So the physical community vanished. And the other thing I would also see as a change is the loss of this enterprise and independence, right? Because now you depend. If you want a house, you have to go into the HDB system. Right? There's hardly any alternative system unless you were well enough to own one of the private houses. So you became less independent, not just in terms of housing, but overall, right? As a person, your outlook changed completely, right? So what do I do if I have a problem? Write to the MP, call the police. The other thing that is kind of linked to this, right, is loss of entrepreneurs, right? As people began to look for jobs. Now, who wants to set up a business and take that risk, right? For your capital, for your time, for your resources, and set up a business. So the business entrepreneurship that had highlighted a lot of the history of the economic history, the commercial history of Singapore in the colonial era, that disappeared mostly. And it's very hard to bring that back today. So a lot of change, a lot of good change. The housing was superior, of course, safer, no more fires. The only fires that happened were quite deadly in a HDB flat, but they wouldn't spread to the next flats. A lot more affluence as your wages grew and you put all your efforts, all your time into your work and your children's education because you want your children to become as well as you and probably better than you, economically speaking, and in terms of social status. But there have also been consequences. There can't have been just positive developments. There have been consequences as well.
Now, there's often a sense of nostalgia when we talk about something like a kampong spirit that Singaporeans fondly recall as an example of a simpler time, a friendly time, and things like that. How accurate is this nostalgic view of residential areas back then?
Nostalgia is often romanticized idea of the past, image of the past. When I wrote the book, right, 15 years ago, I was a lot more skeptical about nostalgia. I'm a lot more sympathetic to it now because you begin to understand why the nostalgia happened and what nostalgia is, right? Nostalgia is literally, right? The word nostalgia is pain from a wound. So the wound is real, even if the idea, the image of the past isn't completely accurate. The wound is one that catches up with you. So I think like I said earlier, when the young people in the kampong got moved, received the keys to the HDB flat, they were very excited. It's something that catches up with you when you are in your middle age or in your retirement, and you find that what's left, what is there to look forward to. So for some of the people, the older people today, there is a sense that they regretted never taking a photo of the kampong or never appreciating the kampong enough. For others, it's something they have felt all along, right? Especially those who have fond memories of the kampong and their family living in the kampong. So the nostalgia is going to grow. Yeah. I mean, just talk a little bit about my podcast, right? Chronicles of Old Singapore. People are nostalgic over the things they experienced, which they associate with very positive parts of their life, with their childhood, with their family in the past, with their schools. So my latest podcast, right, is with Seng. He lived in Mandai and he went to a Chinese school in the Mandai area. He hated school. He is in his mid 70s. So he's born in 1950, one of the baby boomers. He's Chinese educated, very traditional family in Mandai, a rural family, right? So it's a kampong, but it's a completely different kampong from Bukit Ho Swee. So the school he went to, he had minimal interest in education. He was almost like forced to go to school. And he had to, the biggest problem for him was he had to work outside of school. So in the morning, he would wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. to tap rubber. Just imagine tapping rubber. And then work the farm. So I think, so if you look at the generation after that, some of his peers were lucky enough to go to a English educated school, and families that were better off, right, didn't have to force their children to work on the farms. Those children had a much more positive view of education, and successive generations of Singaporeans who went to school. Increasingly, school became, I think, a fond memory for many people. And that's why there are so many of these alumnus groups around. So yeah, nostalgia is a thing. See now, HDB flats have become objects of nostalgia, right? And that's all very real, because some of the early HDB flats are reaching the end of their shelf life. Many of them are upgraded. If they cannot be upgraded, they are en bloc and demolished to make way for new BTOs and all that. So there's a never-ending cycle of destruction and redevelopment. And nostalgia will not disappear, even in fact exacerbate with increasingly educated populations, increasingly aging population as well. So I think we've got to do something about that. With how do we conserve our houses? How do we document our memories? So I think it's important to have a podcast as one of the ways to remember what people remember, what they feel about the places they were lost to time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Loh, for sharing your views with us today.
No worries, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.